My name is Ingrid. I am 28 years old, but the experience I am sharing did not happen to me. It happened to my husband when he was just a baby. Of course, he heard about it later because he doesn't remember anything that occurred. However, it is true that my in-laws and my brothers-in-law swear that it really happened. My husband, Javier, was just a baby at the time. He must have been about 11 months old, and although he obviously doesn't remember, his mother, his grandmother, and even his cousins have told the story so many times at home that it is still recounted as if it had happened yesterday. This took place in the year 1992, when my husband's family went to spend a night camping in the Benito Juarez forest in the northern mountains of Oaxaca. On that occasion, his grandmother, his parents, my husband as a baby, and his cousins were all there. Everything had started off very well, calmly, as it usually does on a trip where you just want to cook, spend time, and sleep in the cold countryside. At night, after having dinner and organizing their things, everyone went to sleep in their tents. My mother-in-law went to sleep very close to my husband, wrapping him up well because up in the mountains, the air cuts through you in the middle of the night. She says she was very peaceful until she suddenly woke up with a very strange feeling, a feeling that something was missing. At that moment, she sat up, still half asleep, and reached out her hand to touch the child, but she says he wasn't there. At first she thought he might have moved under the blankets, but no. She then woke up my father-in-law abruptly and began to ask him about the child, but he didn't know anything either. In a hurry, they rushed out of the tent, barely putting on their shoes, and started searching around the campsite. They called out for the baby as if he could answer, using every means possible to find him. Then came the same scenario as in the stories we always hear. One searches first where it seems logical close by, among the belongings, among the logs, among the trees, thinking perhaps he crawled away, but nothing. The child simply did not appear. It was then that the grandmother said something that made everyone's blood run cold. She said the air smelled foul, like excrement, and that was never a good sign in the countryside. She was a woman of old-fashioned beliefs, one of those who knew prayers for evils that others didn't even dare to name. According to her, when the forest feels that heavy and the smell changes suddenly, it isn't always because of a dead animal. Sometimes it is because something is nearby, and that night, while everyone was searching desperately for the baby, the grandmother said that a witch had taken her grandson. Instead of screaming more, the woman stood firm and began to pray the Magnificent and then other prayers that, according to her, served to defeat witches and force them to drop whatever they were carrying in their hands. My husband told me that his mother always said the grandmother's voice sounded different that night. It sounded strong, as if she were afraid of nothing. Something fundamental when those prayers are recited. My mother-in-law says that right as she was halfway through the prayer, a loud scream was heard in the forest, a very dry scream, like that of an old woman, but terrifying, followed almost instantly by a baby's crying. Everyone ran toward where that sound had come from, and that was where they found my husband. According to the family, he was lying on the forest floor about 200 or 300 meters from where the camp was. The poor thing was crying with all his might. He was all alone, with no one around, no clear footprints or anything, and of course with no explanation as to how he had arrived at that spot. My mother-in-law picked him up, trembling, and hugged him so tightly she could barely carry him from the pure nerve of it. And of course, as expected, they didn't stay a minute longer in that forest. They gathered everything as best they could and left that place while it was still early morning. In his family, they always remained with the same idea. That night, he had not just wandered off through the field, but that, in fact, just as his grandmother said, a witch had taken him. And if it hadn't been for the grandmother being there to pray those prayers, they probably would have never found him. I don't know if these things exist in communities, but every time my husband or the family tells this story, they make me think it is completely true. And I think it could be. Why? What would a whole family gain by telling me a lie? CH family, I remind you that we have new videos every day and live streams every Wednesday and Saturday night. We are waiting for you to tell us your story. Let's continue. Good evening, community. My name is Mauricio. I have been a follower of the channel for a few months. I like the variety of topics you handle, and I especially like those about the fields and the forest, mainly because I lived through something very ugly in the forest, and it is about that I send my story on this occasion, hoping you can listen to it. Everything happened in 2012 when I took my family on vacation to the Sierra de Abertanchipa, which is in San Luis Potosi, Mexico. On that occasion, we were only 4 people. My wife, my 2 children, and I. We wanted to get out of the routine, breathe clean air, walk through the real bush, and clear our minds a bit. During the day, everything was very calm, even beautiful. We walked along paths, saw many birds, squirrels, took photographs, ate right there, and honestly, we were having a great time. My children were excited because they didn't always get to go out like that, and I also felt happy to see them calm, far from the noise and heat of the city. At night, we set up the tent in an area where we were allowed to camp, and since there was no one nearby, we felt like we were even more alone in that place. The moon was completely full. I remember that very well, huge, one of those that lights up almost like dawn with a light bulb on. You could see a good part of the field, even the edge of the forest, without needing a flashlight. Later, we had a light dinner and stayed for a while chatting outside the tent, hearing only the noises of the forest, crickets, branches snapping, some frogs, some distant sound of an animal wandering around, everything normal that you can find in a forest. Then, one of my sons, the older one, 17 years old, told me he was going to the bathroom behind some bushes nearby, as there was a secluded area not too far where he could do his business without any problem. So he went alone because it wasn't far and I could see him when he entered the tall grass. My son didn't take long to return, but when he did, he came back agitated. Not scared, I clarify that, but rather excited. He was almost smiling and searching for his phone among his things. That's why I asked him what was going on, and he said in a low but hurried voice, "Dad, there is a deer in the clearing. It's huge. I want to film it to show my friends." I was also very excited by what he said. You don't see a deer so close every day, let alone at night. So I grabbed the phone and told him to take me to where he had seen it. My wife told us not to take long, so I went with him and we walked very slowly, being careful not to make noise so we wouldn't scare that deer. My son led me to some bushes where you could see a semi-cleared plain, like a gap between the forest vegetation. And yes, right there it was. It was a deer, or at least that's what I thought at first, since it was standing right in the middle of the field, still not doing anything. The moon hit it head on, and it looked quite clear. Although it wasn't eating, in fact, it wasn't sniffing the ground, and it didn't look scared either. It was just standing there, looking around the whole field, but not like a common, ordinary animal. Rather, it was as if it were keeping watch, as if it were looking for something or someone. I stayed crouched behind the bushes with my son beside me, and suddenly I started to feel something strange in my body, something like in discomfort, like when you know something isn't right in the environment. My son was already raising his phone to record when the deer did something that, to this day, community, makes it hard for me to remember without my skin crawling. That damn deer stood up, but it didn't get up with a jump or by adjusting itself. Of course not. It stood up on 2 legs, on its hind legs, as if it were a person or an attempt at walking like a person. At that moment, I felt like I lost the ability to speak. I was dead with fear, I can assure you, community. The animal remained erect with its body stretched out in a horrific way, as the front legs half shrunken hung strangely, and with its head stiff, it turned from one side to the other as if looking for something or someone. At that moment, we realized it was not a deer. Rather, it looked like a person dressed up as a deer, but perfectly camouflaged to make it even more horrible. That thing that looked like a deer, which I am sure was not, let out a sound that I still haven't forgotten. It wasn't a roar, but it wasn't a squeal, nor even a growl. Community. It was like a muffled scream. It was more like the scream of a person choked in a very old throat. At that instant, my son let out a curse, and I also screamed out of pure fright. That deer, or whatever that thing was, upon hearing us, ran off into the forest, but it did so by running like a person that is on 2 legs, taking horrible, poorly executed, and fast strides at the same time as it was lost in the thickness of the forest, just like that, in the middle of the darkness. We, dead with fear, returned to the camp almost stumbling. My wife, just by looking at our faces, understood that something very bad had happened to us. I didn't explain much to her. I told her we better pack everything and leave immediately. We gathered the tent as best we could, threw our things into the truck, and left that place without looking back. My children were totally silent. My wife asked several times what it was that we had seen, but I couldn't tell her properly until we were far enough away from that forest. Since then, I haven't gone camping in such a place. And every time someone brings up the topic of strange animals, I always tell this community because that time, in a quite disturbing way in the middle of the forest, we saw a deer that walked on 2 legs. If you like the story, you help us a lot by liking and subscribing to the channel. If you consider it, and we have earned it, that you can also hype our videos so that more of the community can hear us. Let's continue. Good evening, community. My name is Emmanuel, and I experienced this in the year 2014 when I went with 2 friends to camp near Oaxaca in Yucatan, a place that is very forested and is a tourist site with many recreational activities. On that trip, we were only 3 people, my compadre Ivan, our friend El Chino, and me. Of course, the idea was to spend a quiet night in the bush, make a bonfire, have a drink, talk nonsense, and return the next day in the afternoon. We had been to that place before, so it wasn't like we were scared of any noise in the field. Besides, that area is quite calm. In fact, there was a more open part between the vegetation where you could set up the tent without any major problem, and luckily it wasn't so far from the town as to feel lost. Everything was very calm at the beginning. We made the bonfire, had dinner, laughed a little, and even recorded videos to upload when we got home. But around 11 at night, the bush started to get a little quieter. The forest was very silent, and it is well known that that happens when the night is going to be quite heavy and one has to be very careful. We were all doing our own thing when Ivan went to pee among some bushes, not very far, and after a while he came back a bit agitated, just as if he were very impressed because he saw something. At that moment we asked him what had happened because clearly his eyes were wide open. He was having a little trouble speaking, and he was sweating even though it was a bit cold. He told us, stuttering, that there was a blue light rotating above a small hill right behind some trees. We thought he was making it up, or that he had seen some distant lantern from a camper, because in that direction many people go to camp at night, but he insisted that it wasn't that. In fact, he told us that we better go with him so that we could verify with our own eyes what he had seen. That's how we approached slowly to that place. We did it without making much noise, and right behind those trees he had mentioned, indeed, there was a sphere of blue color suspended in the air about 2 or 3 meters from the ground. The strange thing is that that thing made no noise, didn't buzz, nor did it seem to have a motor, nothing. It was just there floating with a very even light, as if it were breathing, but very slightly. I felt a strange cold in my chest when I saw it, because it is one thing to look at something from afar in the sky and a very different one to have that thing almost in front of you, stuck in the middle of the bush, as if it didn't care that people were seeing it. El Chino took out his phone to record exactly what we were seeing, but at that instant, the screen started to fail. First it went black, then it turned on, then it froze, and it didn't want to respond to the phone at all. Then we saw something that, to this day, I find very difficult to explain. From the lower part of that blue sphere, 2 small figures appeared. At first I thought they were children because they looked thin, short, with long arms. But they walked funny, not weird, but funny, as if they didn't really know how to move their bodies on the earth. They took clumsy, disjointed steps, and some did advance fast. I remember they didn't run, but they didn't walk entirely normally either. I repeat, they walked funny. We stayed there watching for a good while without talking, since I felt that if we made noise, those things were going to find us. Although, curiously, they were looking toward where we were hiding. I don't know if they saw our faces or just felt that we were around there, but the 2 figures stopped at the same time and turned slowly toward where we were. Despite everything, I couldn't see their faces well, but I did understand one thing. Those were not children. Ivan was the first to back away. Afterward, I followed him, and El Chino fell out of pure fright. That's why we better went back running to the camp, practically dead with fear. But it is here that another very strange thing happened. Community. When we arrived, the tent was ajar. We were sure we had left it closed, and inside our backpacks were moved, and there was a weird smell like hot metal, more or less like iron. Since we were really very scared and didn't know what was happening, we threw everything into the truck and left that place once and for all. Already on the highway, none of us wanted to talk about the topic, and we only did so until we reached a village with more people. Unfortunately, of that experience, community, we don't have any proof, since my friend's phone, as well as ours, could never record anything, and we couldn't take a photograph of those supposed children or that blue ball that had come down from the sky. But of what we are completely sure, community, is that on that occasion we saw UFOs, extraterrestrials, and it was right in a forest in Yucatan. Family, I invite you to be part of the channel's members and enjoy all the benefits it has. For example, like seeing your name, which is appearing at this moment. Let's continue. Good evening, dear storyteller community. My name is Daniel, and I want to share something that my cousin Hector told me just a few months ago. Hector has always been one of those who enjoys nature, the forests, and the outdoors. Since he was young, he used to go camping with his friends, and in all his trips, nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened to them on the excursions, at least not until that night in which, in his words, they encountered someone who should never have been there. In that camping trip, there were 3 campers, Hector, Luis, and Sam. They were all around 25 years old. One Friday afternoon, they loaded the backpacks into the car and left, heading to a forested area in the United States in the north of North Carolina, to be more precise. A place with little traffic, but surrounded by large pines and low mountains that seemed to watch over that landscape. The group arrived when the sun had barely set. The forest was dyed in long shadows, and the air felt very cool, impregnating the smell of wet earth and dry leaves. There they installed a tent, collected dry branches, and lit a bonfire. The orange glow illuminated their faces and kept the insects away, and even the cold. They all sat around the fire, ate something light, and began to tell horror stories. That was their custom on every camping trip. Laughter and fake ooze mixed with the crackling of the wood, something very good in a camp. Everything seemed perfect until something began to change. Hector remembers it was close to 11 at night when they heard the first noise. A loud crunch, like someone stepping on dry branches among the trees. "Did you hear that?" asked Sam, looking into the darkness. Luis turned off his flashlight and remained silent, as if trying to listen better. The forest was generally full of noises, crickets, wind, small animals, but that was different. This repeated itself closer and closer. "Maybe it's a deer," said Hector, although deep down he wasn't convinced either, feeling that the 3 of them became very tense. The fire illuminated only a few meters around, and beyond that, everything was absolute blackness. Then, suddenly, from among the bushes, a young man of about 26 perhaps came out, with a pale face and light eyes. The young man raised his hands in a gesture of peace and spoke with a calm voice. "Quiet, don't be scared. I am a camper too. I was with my family on the other side of the valley, and I got lost while taking a night walk." The 3 friends breathed a little more relieved, although something in the way that stranger had appeared disconcerted them. "Well, you were saved from continuing to walk in the dark, my friend," said Luis, trying to sound friendly. "If you want, you can stay with us, as it is dangerous to walk alone at these hours." The young man smiled just as he accepted. He sat near the bonfire, and Hector gave him a plate with grilled meat and a glass of water. At first, everything seemed normal. The young man ate slowly, drank gulps of water, and thanked every bite with a polite smile. But after a few minutes, Hector noticed something strange. The plate was still full and the glass intact. However, the 3 of them had seen him bring the food to his mouth, chew it, swallow, and drink. It was impossible, but the content of the plate did not diminish at all. A chill ran down Hector's spine. He tried to ignore it, thinking it was fatigue or a trick of his mind, but when he crossed gazes with Luis and Sam, he knew they had also noticed. The tension became unbearable. No one said anything, but everyone thought it. That young man was a ghost. The silence was only broken by the sound of the bonfire. The young man seemed to enjoy the company of the night as if he needed to be there with them. From time to time, he looked up toward the forest as if waiting for someone in the darkness. After a long while, he stood up slowly and said, "Thank you for the food and for letting me stay with you, but my family must be waiting for me and I don't want them to worry anymore, so I'm leaving," he said with a strangely hollow voice. After that, he turned around and began to walk toward the forest, getting lost among the trees. There were no more crunches on branches, no more steps, only silence. The 3 friends remained paralyzed. Hector, with a trembling hand, turned toward the plate and the glass. Both remained exactly the same, intact, as if they had never been touched. That night was a bit complicated for them, as they couldn't get any sleep, since in some way it was difficult to be able to understand that a ghost visited them that night. My cousin says that for a long while he remained awake with the fire lit until the first lights of dawn painted the whole sky. Upon checking the forest around, there were no footprints or traces that anyone had been there. The ground was intact, with no marks. The only thing that remained was the memory of that young man, his dull smile, and the way in which he ate without really eating. My cousin Hector told me weeks later, still with a serious face and a low voice, as if by repeating it he could invoke that thing again. I want to think it was a collective bad dream, an hallucination caused by fatigue, but when Hector looks me in the eyes and swears that they all saw it, that they all noticed the intact plate, it convinces me that it wasn't a dream. Out there, in that immense forest of the United States, there are things that should not walk among the living, and sometimes they approach the heat of a bonfire just to remind us that we are not alone in this world. Good evening to all the storyteller community. My name is Felipe Morales, and I currently live in the city of Puebla, but I am originally from a small town in Oaxaca. I am reaching out to all of you, as I want to share something that happened to me a few years ago, and that to this day I find very hard to tell without feeling a shiver down my spine. For a long time, my life was simple. Work, home, work. Over time, I started hanging out with a group of companions who, like me, sought to distract themselves from the routine. With them, the habit of going on excursions to the nearby hills and mountains was born. One weekend, we organized to visit a forest park in the Oaxacan Sierra, a place far from the noise of mountains and deep sugarcane fields. This was a place little known, which made it perfect to spend a day of tranquility among friends, drinking beer, chatting, and walking among the trails. That Saturday, we arrived at noon under an intense sun. Each one carried their backpack with food, drinks, and some flashlights in case the late night caught us. Just as we started walking, we encountered a forest ranger, or caretaker rather, as they are called here in Mexico. He was an older man with a face weathered by the sun who warned us of one thing with a serious voice. Don't stay until late at the top. Remember that the park closes around 5, and once it is closed, it is difficult for someone to come and get you out of here. Upon hearing that, we said yes, although between laughs we continued our path thinking that nothing would happen. The idea was to climb to the highest mountain in the park, stay for a while at the top, and then descend with time to spare. The journey was calm. We barely encountered a couple of families coming down, and after that the trail was ours alone. The shade of the trees covered us, and the silence of the bush was so deep that the echo of our laughter could be heard. We arrived at the highest point shortly after 2 inches the afternoon, and there it was. The view was impressive, a sea of green mountains and deep valleys that seemed to never end. We sat on a large rock, opened the food, and took out the beers. Between chatting and jokes, time passed without us realizing it, and by the time I looked at the watch, it was already 4 inches the afternoon. It was time to go down. "I think it's time to leave," said Mario, one of my friends. "It won't be long before it closes, so it's better to hurry." In a hurry, we gathered our things and started the descent. That was easier because everything was downhill, and we still had beer that we were drinking while we chatted. Suddenly, Hector, the quietest of the group, pointed to the top of a cliff of a mountain in front of us. "Hey, are you guys seeing that too?" We looked up. At the top of that hill, right at the edge of the cliff, 2 human figures were clearly visible. At first, we thought they were 2 other hikers, but something was weird with them. Compared to the trees behind them, those silhouettes were too big, as if they measured more than 2 or perhaps 3 meters in height. We stayed in silence for a few seconds. "Who could they be?" asked Mario, nervous. Well, we didn't see anyone else on the road. A chill ran down my spine because something told me that what we were seeing was not normal. But then, as we looked at them more, a third man appeared. This one walked with a firm step until he stood next to the other 2. The 3 remained motionless with their gaze toward the horizon, oblivious to our presence, but we couldn't resist anymore. We shouted to them as loudly as we could, "Hey, they are closing the park. In a moment more, get down or you are going to get locked in." We shouted to them because we kept thinking they were visitors just like us, but none of them reacted. It was as if they didn't hear us. We kept shouting one and another time until suddenly the 3 turned their heads toward us, but their reaction was strange. They got scared. Without thinking, the 3 ran toward the forest that was behind them, hiding among the trees with surprising speed. The silence took over our group, as no one understood what the hell was happening. We only looked at each other with pale faces, trying to understand what we had seen, and what if they weren't campers, said Hector in a low voice. No one answered him, but deep down we knew he was possibly right. What we saw were not campers. Since time was pressuring us, we started to descend as fast as we could, such that we reached the entrance of the park shortly before 5. The forest ranger was still there, checking some things. We approached, agitated, and told him what we had seen. 3 people on a cliff, too big to be normal. The man remained silent for a few seconds and then, with a serious face, told us, what were those men like? We described the silhouettes, the height, and the way they ran into the forest. The guard paled, took his radio, and murmured barely audibly, "They saw them again." Those words made our blood run cold. What was the guard referring to? Who are they? What were they? That's why we asked him, nervous, who we saw. The man didn't answer anymore. He just gathered his things in a hurry and told us, "Keep your things and go home. Don't ask anymore." For months, that remained as an anecdote among us until recently one of my friends brought up the topic again. He told me that he had heard stories in the Oaxacan Sierra of giant men who inhabit the depths of the hills. Some call them ancient guardians, while others assure that they are beings like the famous Bigfoot. I don't know the truth of what they were, but what I saw that afternoon with my own eyes will not be erased from my memory. 3 colossal figures at the top of the cliff, fleeing like timid animals. Since then, every time I look back at the mountains at sunset, I can't avoid thinking that between the shadows of the trees, someone much bigger than us is still observing us. If you have any story that you wish to share with this pleasant community, I invite you to send it, whether by email or the Facebook page. I would appreciate it if you activate all notifications to be up to date with the stories that are uploaded daily. Thank you very much for letting me reach your ears. I am the storyteller.